Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As I'm sure a number of you know, I slipped on the grass. I think of all the crazy things I've done in my life and came out unscathed. I slipped on the grass back in September and broke my leg and ankle, so I'm still a little banged up, although I think I have managed to make it through the ice with a 9-month-old German Shepherd puppy and without being killed. So I'm grateful for that. Let's read together Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21. Do not treasure up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust disfigure, and where thieves break through and steal. But treasure up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust disfigure, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will also be your heart. Now that passage is often presented emphasizing the negative, that it's a warning. And it does begin with the negative. Apparently Jesus learned to teach from someone other than my mother, who told me never to begin with the negative. But sometimes that's appropriate if there's a special danger. And I think that one of the things that we'll talk about this afternoon is that there is danger here. But it's also a promise, right? That just as treasures that are poorly chosen inevitably corrupt the heart, so treasures that are nobly chosen inevitably lift the heart. That God's gifts can be a powerful force drawing us to Him rather than luring us away. And like much of the Sermon on the Mount, it is more than a warning or a promise, more even than a judgment of good and evil. It is a reminder of just how the world works, of inescapable reality. Every time, right, we invest ourselves in things that are trivial and foolish, we diminish ourselves and are distracted from the noble and the eternal. But conversely, every time that we invest ourselves in the noble and the eternal, it makes us more likely to value the noble and the eternal. What I regard as the best single comment in the writing of C.S. Lewis is his comment that every single moral decision changes who we are. And his great skill is using language to capture ideas in ways that stick in the mind for the common reader. And he says that every single moral decision leaves a mark on the soul. And he's not talking about the fact that we sometimes can mess up our lives so that we can't get back to where we would have been if we hadn't messed them up. He's not talking about the physical result. He's not saying that a bad marriage hurts our ability to serve God in other ways. Of course it does. But he's saying it's that internal decision of the will that changes who we are. Using the metaphor that the New Testament uses, as well as, for that matter, as well as the Old Testament, of life as a journey, as a path. Every single step that we take that is on the path draws us closer to God. It just does. And every single step away from the path leads us into dangers that are unnecessary and perhaps destructive, that may make it much more difficult for us to find the path again. Now, today I want to address, in as far as possible, a practical way. And I understand that for an academic to be practical, there's something wrong there, and especially for somebody from Harvard to say something practical seems a little tough to believe. But to address in as practical a way as possible how we can make our attitude toward wealth and our use of wealth as something that brings us closer to God rather than draws us away from Him. And I will do so guided by biblical principles, but also in the light of my own personal experience. Now, I understand the dangers of inserting too much of one's personal background in connection with biblical teaching. As a general rule, I would say to young people who are present, the less you say about yourself in teaching, probably the better. It's a dangerous thing. But on this point, I'd like to try to convince you, since I'm offering practical advice, that I have some glimmer of what I'm talking about. I grew up in East Tennessee in what had been coal mining country. And there was an iron foundry in town as well. The iron ore played out before I was born, and the coal played out about the time that I was being born. I don't believe I was responsible for the coal playing out. Right? That's an example of the philosophical truth that simultaneity does not imply connection. But there were no jobs. Right? Something like, when I was born, something like 1/4 of the people in the county could not read or write. I started preaching in a congregation. Why was I preaching it the week after I turned 14? And one answer is that the other men in that congregation could not read or write. And it's a world that's gone now. But to give you some idea of that world, and I'm glad it's gone in many ways, but to give you some idea of that world, I was delivering Christmas baskets as a high school student. And I was feeling mighty good about it. Right? Say, oh, this is really good work. And we delivered baskets to various homes, and there was the last address on the list was a cabin up in the hills, and it was awful. Little children playing in the dirt that you could hardly tell the children from the dirt, right? And the cabin disheveled, and you felt like you were taking your hands by walking up the steps to the little porch. When I knocked on it was so bad that we matched quarters. We flipped quarters to see who had to go and deliver the basket. I lost. And so I went up and knocked on the door. A woman answered, or at least I'm told that she was a woman, because you could scarcely tell that she was a human being. The right side of her face was gone. It was a mass of discolored flesh with no discernible form. As I thought of that woman dying, no doubt wondering what would happen to those little dirty children when she was gone, I felt a whole lot less righteous about delivering Christmas baskets. I've seen real poverty. Americans worry about poverty, and what they really mean is they're worried about being less rich. And being less rich may be unpleasant, but it's not a tragedy. But poverty, real poverty, can be a tragedy, and I don't mean to romanticize it in any way. And from that background, I went to Harvard on scholarship. My father was a dentist, but he was an alcoholic dentist, a very sweet, lovable, totally undependable man who left us with nothing. Our car was repossessed the week after he died. And at Harvard, I didn't have any money. Now, I wasn't in want because, hey, I had a meal card. Actually, they didn't have meal cards, but there was a place where you could go and they didn't ask you for your card. Imagine that. And get meals. But I didn't have any money. That first semester, I was very sick once. I went to the university doctor, and he said, you know, you're very sick. And he gave me a prescription, and I was too proud to tell him that I didn't have money to buy that prescription. So I went back to my room and cried myself to sleep, and I got well. So I've seen, and to a certain extent experienced, not having any money, and I've seen great wealth. Right? My friends, not just casual acquaintances, but close friends, included people, the heirs of great fortunes, some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the United States. And I spent 9 years in mission work and then went back to law school and graduated from Yale Law School, practiced law with one of the largest law firms in the United States, became ultimately one of the principal executive officers of a Fortune 1000 company, and have sat on the boards of directors of other public companies. So I've seen poverty and I've seen wealth and I've experienced it to some extent myself. Now, based on that experience, let me suggest 7 points that have application to life in general, but that I wish to focus today on application to our use of money. And you can think of this in a way as a business program. 7 points are these. Number 1, decide what it is that you want. Number 2, count the cost of what that goal requires. Number 3, make a plan to achieve that goal. Number 4, work the plan. Number 5, be alert against problems, things that will defeat the plan and prevent you from reaching the goal. Number 6, revise the plan as necessary. And number 7, enjoy success. Now let's go back and start with number 1. Decide what you want in life. How would you word it at this point in your life? What is it that you want? And I can remember a time when, as a young person, becoming a Christian, that what I wanted was to go to heaven. That's not how I would phrase it now. I vastly would prefer that to the alternative, right? But I'm not interested in the minimum requirements for entry into heaven. I'm just not. That's not what I want in life. If that were what I wanted, would heaven be heaven? Quite apart from the very serious question of, would God let me in if what I wanted to do was sneak in? Somewhere along the line, when I was a college student, it changed for me. You remember see, for me, it's tied to a specific hymn that I heard for the first, I never heard it growing up, but I heard it in the church that I attended in college. "O sacred head, O sacred head, now wounded, with sorrow and grief weighed down, now scornfully surrounded with thorns, thine only crown. How doth that visage languish which once was bright as morn? How, no, I've forgotten it. But I haven't forgotten the second verse. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Oh, make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. See, what I want in life is to love God like he loves me. To live a life. Paul, in 4 different of his letters to 4 different churches, says, live a life that's worthy of the gospel. To do that, to be the person that God intends us to be, it seems to me that that should be the goal. Now, where does money come in? And the answer to that question on this point of what is the ultimate goal is that money's got nothing to do with it. It doesn't appear at all. You cannot serve God and mammon. And my father, I think, thought of himself less as a dentist and more as Doc Holliday. He was a gambler, and I remember as a little boy going into beer joints and the pool hall and the backroom poker games. So sometimes my vocabulary, my examples seem a little questionable, right? I remember when I was a missionary, one of my supporters said that I played pool suspiciously well for a preacher. Okay, using the language of the poker game, Christianity has no place for people who don't go all in. You want to hedge your bets about God's love, and you can't do it. The double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, James says. And he's just saying the same thing as Elijah said almost 1,000 years before. That how long can you limp between 2 opinions? That metaphor has special meaning for me lately. You have to go all in. That's the nature of this goal. And it is true in business. Right? Nobody ever accomplished anything that didn't focus on exactly what it was that they were trying to accomplish. So, first point, decide what you want. Second point, count the cost. In Luke 14, Jesus says to would-be followers that they need to count the cost, and he uses a business example. He says if you're going to build a tower, understand whether or not you have the money before you start laying the foundation, because if you don't and you run out of money, it's ridiculous. Think about, in this connection, the concluding letter of the 7 letters to the churches in Revelation. God says to Laodicea, right, you're lukewarm, and you just make me sick. Count the cost, Jesus says. In Luke 13:24, the previous chapter, Jesus says, strive to enter in at the narrow door, because it's hard, he says. Right? Many will seek to enter in and will not be able. And the word that he uses that's translated strive is the word from which we get our word agony. It's the word that is associated in classical Greek with athletic effort. It's important psychologically, I think, to anticipate the high cost. I once ran the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. And hey, there's I'm sure a bit of implicit boasting to anybody here who knows what the Comrades is. It's the great foot race on the African continent. 20,000 lunatics who agree to run, not just a normal marathon. The thing is in an up year, like I ran, 53 miles from the Indian Ocean up into the mountains. I ran a great 35-mile race. You may have already detected the problem. Right? It was that last 18 miles that was the problem. Now, I say in my defense that it later turned out that I had a partially torn hamstring, and I did finish. But they don't give medals of the Comrades, and you get respect, by the way, if you wear Comrades insignia in Africa. But they don't give medals for running great 35-mile races. Right? They give medals for finishing. And I want to go to heaven, to see God, to see him as he sees me, face to face. That's the goal. And so I need to understand things like that everyone, right, all Christians are going to suffer persecution. I need to understand the cost that is going to come. In the same way, my other hobby is mountain climbing, right? And the goal right there is not just to get to the top, but to get back in one piece, to have achieved that. And to do that requires that you plan ahead. And it requires an immense amount of training. My wife has told this on me several times, but she called over at No Excuses, the gym in town, once when she needed to speak to me. I didn't have my phone, and the person answering the phone didn't know who I was, and so she said, "Oh, he's the guy who's sweating." How bad I've been thrown out of gyms for sweating too much. Do you realize how much you have to sweat to get thrown out of the gym for sweating too much? Right? Well, why? Why do I always look like the person who's about to die? Because I don't want to die on the mountain. Right? And the way not to die on the mountain is to, as Paul describes of himself in Christian life, he says, I buffet my body. It's a word that means like I bruise myself, right? I show self-restraint in about everything so that I can win the prize. What is true about mountain climbing, I mean, which is easier, right? To climb some mountain or to become like Jesus of Nazareth? I think that that's going to require all the training, all the discipline that I can possibly manage. And so the same thing would be true, especially when it comes to money. Train financially for the long haul. My attitude about money, I must say, my mother gave reactions that you would not expect at some crucial points in my life. When I went away to school, I'd get a free education at Harvard University. Should she be thrilled? No, well, she sobbed, right, because she was afraid I would lose my faith. And she was wrong. I found my faith there. But when I decided to become a gospel preacher, was she going to be thrilled? No, she thought I was crazy. Right? I spent the first 6 years of my married life without any health insurance. Our second daughter was born, and we paid for her on the installment plan, right, as though she were a used car. I went those first 6 years not only never having a positive net worth, but never having more than about $100 at any one time in my bank account that hadn't already been spent. Was that a good idea? Now I thought, you know why I did that? Because I knew, and I still think today I was right. I knew that there were people who loved me and would take care of me if I needed them to. And I believe that's true. I didn't need them. I didn't have that emergency. But it's not a sin, right, to provide for your family. And I'm not sure that it's a good thing for some young people to follow my example in that. Providing for your family, life insurance, some savings for retirement. What you wish to do is to do that which allows you to serve God over a lifetime to the very best of your ability, in accordance as best you know how with His will. So, decide what it is that you want, count the cost, and then make a plan. There is a difference between an ultimate goal and the planned path to that goal, right? If I run a marathon, I want to be able to run the entire race, and I therefore need to run at a pace that will allow me to finish that race. If I try to run at a pace that is impossible for me, it'll be a fiasco. I will run out. How do you know that pace, by the way? Well, you train yourself. You learn, training for the marathon, what it is that you're capable of doing. Now, let me use the example of budgeting in business. Well, I had some surprises when I went into business. And one of the surprises that was very remarkable was the extreme importance and necessity of budgeting. At the close of my business career, how much time did I spend on budgeting? I was not the chief financial officer, but the chief financial officer reported to me. And the answer is between 600 and 800 hours of my time, spread over the entire 12 months. Once you got through one budgeting cycle, you immediately started on the next. Why? And the answer is that you've got to know what it is that you're trying to do, right? The other aspect of business that I never even thought of, I thought of it, in fact, as sort of a joke, and bureaucratically it can be a joke. It's not just a piece of paper, but this idea of job description. Right? A well-run business is composed of people who are given specific tasks, and they know what it is that they're being asked to do for the success of the institution. The same thing's going to be true for human beings. What is it that I want? What specifically can I do this year to cause that to happen? Because it isn't going to happen automatically. I've often used that term to my students. I'm a little more careful with it since I noticed that in the paragraph that follows the discussion of the parable of the sower in Mark, it said that the seed bears fruit automatos, right? Exactly our word automatically. God's word does not return to him void. It accomplishes the purposes whereunto it has been set. But it still has to be sowed. Right? The thorns still have to be removed. The rocks ought to be removed from the field. If you want to accomplish anything in life of real value, it isn't going to happen except by an intentional life. There's a book, I've never read the book. I looked at it a little bit and I thought, no. But I like the title, The Purpose-Driven Life. I want every single day of my life to be aimed at what my life is aimed at, because that's the only way that it can work. Now, I want to say that I want to accomplish, how much good do I want to accomplish for God? How much good should you want to accomplish for God? The answer is all that you can, right? And so in a business, how much money do you want? Well, you want to make all the money that you can. And so you examine everything you do. In making the budget, you examine everything you do and say, is that worth it? Is that the highest and best use to which we can put our resources? All right, in personal life. Ask yourself, no, I'm not talking about financial efficiency toward making more money. I'm talking about financial efficiency toward making a noble and happy life in this world and in the world to come. What can you do with, you ought to be asking yourself, right? What can you do with your money that brings heaven closer, that makes you more prepared for it? So you make the plan and you work the plan. In my business, I worked for, I've said before, I've worked for the nonprofit sector most of my adult life. Some of it was intentionally nonprofit, but some of it was unintentionally nonprofit. I worked for an American subsidiary of the largest mining company in the world, and they didn't have a clue. It was a mess, that American subsidiary. But a difference, right? In the company I worked for that was the most successful mining company in America, we produced a daily profit and loss statement. Right? We looked every single day. Are we doing actually what we said we were going to do? And is it working? A degree of self-knowledge and the willingness to put in the effort is necessary if money is to have its proper place in our lives. Practical, balance your checkbook. Now, I used to be able to say that, but hey, our young people don't have checkbooks, right? They've got little cards, and that's a problem. Because when you're 20, generally speaking, you can buy anything you want. The problem is that ultimately somebody will insist that you pay for it. Keep track. Know what it is that you're spending your money on. What are you genuinely investing in? Don't be surprised. I'm going to have to go on to cover. I prepared too much material here, and so, hey, let me go a little bit faster. Work the plan every day and be aware of problems. And by problems, I mean those things even before they occur, or things that might be occurring and you not detect them, but are just part of human experience, part of being a human being. One example is mistaking luxury for necessity. I can recall somebody, it still breaks my heart. A man left his wife and children And I just couldn't imagine walking away from those 3 little children. But part of it is that he was under tremendous stress. He was a successful professional, but I think both he and his wife, he blamed it on his wife, but I believe he was also responsible. They defined the life that they wanted in such a way as to create tremendous stress. You don't need a big house. I mean, isn't it ironic that big houses are usually owned by people who don't have children at all? You really don't need that, right? You don't need the fancy new car. You certainly don't need the will-o'-the-wisp of financial security. Finances never made anybody secure. Don't mistake luxury for necessity. And don't create needless necessity. I had a young man, because people in business knew my background, I occasionally had people who worked for me come to me for advice. And so there was a young man who had been made the president of one of our subsidiaries, and he came to me for personal advice. He said, you know, this is the first time I'm making real money, and back then he made maybe $250,000 a year, which was real money, right, 30 years ago. And he said, we've looked at this house, and do you think I should buy it? And I said, speaking for the company, I'd say, go to it, right? Buy that house. You know, because if you buy that house, we own you. You can't make this kind of money anywhere else, and you'll do whatever we say to continue making it. But as a human being, I'd say, don't do it. Right? Don't create in your life a necessity that shouldn't be a necessity. Think about the part of the Sermon on the Mount that follows the passage that I read. Right? Jesus speaking to people who were on the edge, who were one bad harvest away from genuine want, 2 bad harvests away from famine. And he says, don't worry about what you have to eat or what you should put on. My friends who were closest to me, that during the stock collapse in 1973-74, which I think is still the greatest fall in the stock market since the Great Depression, they told me that they were losing $1 million a day. And they expected me, I guess, to feel sympathy for them. I didn't feel any sympathy at all. You realize how much money you have to lose $1 million a day? And yet, a sore evil have I seen under the sun. Riches kept by the owners thereof to their own hurt. People for whom wealth brings nothing but additional worry. And the danger of worldly values, of social pressure. Those same people, and by the way, they're wonderful people. There's not a day in my life that isn't warmed by their love, that isn't instructed by their example. I never knew people of great wealth who bore it better than they bore it. But after they had retired, they became, I started to say elderly, but they were younger than I am. And they lived in Pebble Beach on the 4th hole of the Cypress Point golf course. And I went to see them. And at that point in my career, for the first time, I had a nice title. And I was making a 6-figure income, which again, 35 years ago was a lot of money. And the woman said to me that I regarded as a second mother. She said, we always knew that you would make something of yourself. I didn't say anything to her, but I hope that you can understand how much that hurt me. See, I thought being a gospel preacher was something. And if people like that can make that sort of worldly judgment without thinking about it. If I'd questioned her, right, she would have backed away from that. But if people like that allow that sort of thinking into their lives, what do we allow in without thoughtfulness ourselves? A man's life does not consist of the things he possesses. It just doesn't. And do not do your work. Don't, in money, this is a more complicated one, right? Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says that when you give money to the poor, don't do that work to be seen by men. Don't allow money, even generosity in connection with money, to be a focus of pride. And if you think about it, this gets tougher and tougher, because can you be proud that you give to charity? Yes. Can you be proud that you're not proud of giving to charity? Right? Can you be proud that you're not proud of not being proud? Right? It's an endless thing, right? You're defining yourself by a relationship with money instead of saying to yourself, what have I that I have not received? Every good and perfect gift came from him. Living a life of generosity based in a life of thankfulness. And then revise the plan as necessary. The starting point in business of the next year's budget. There'll be 3 columns if you're doing this sort of thing. And one will be a proposed budget for next year, and the other will be last year's budget, and you know what the third will be. It is the actual, what you've actually done year to date. And if actual doesn't match this past year's budget, well, hey, face reality. You say to yourself, well, I budgeted last year $1,000 for insurance, but it actually cost me $1,200, and so this year, what am I going to budget for insurance? Face reality, right? It's going to cost more than you thought. In the same way, are you prospering spiritually in your use of money? I strongly advise young people, always in my values class, keep a diary. Now, I don't mean by diary a record of who winked at me in chapel, right? I mean a record of what you actually did in your life. And did it work? Did it bring the result that you wished? We sometimes have to revise the plan based on reality, based on what we know will work. As a student, I interviewed with the largest law firm in the United States at the time, and the interviewing partner said two things of me. One, he said, I don't know whether you're going to be a good lawyer or not. I think you ought to be a law professor. Okay, but the other one was a question. He said, why did you change sides? You were on God's side and you became a lawyer. Why did you? Well, the answer is I didn't change sides. Right? I made the decision, and it's the sole reason I made the decision, that was the best way that I could serve God. Circumstances change, and so the plan changes. And all of us grow old. A few people in this room are old enough to remember the A.M. Burtons. Very generous donors, especially to Lipscomb University. And the A.M. Burtons' goal in life, financially, having built a fortune, was to die poor, to give it all away. Again, I don't say that that's necessary for all of us, but all of us have to deal with the fact that we're going to someday grow old. We brought nothing into this world and we'll take nothing out of it. And our ability to serve God changes in various ways. I ask myself, if Christ died for me on the cross, what single minute of my life does not belong to him? Why am I still teaching? Because if Christ died for me at all, he died for all of me. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to retire. I may have already passed my own best if used by date, but we need to ask ourselves, how best can I serve God at this time? And then finally, enjoy success. Wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, Ecclesiastes says, are a gift of God. Jesus said in that one comment that is repeated from his earthly ministry that isn't in the Gospels or in Acts 1, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And I'm here to tell you that that's true. I predict confidently that some of you may miss this point and therefore disagree even on your deathbed, but I would say that the vast majority of you will admit, and that for all of you it will be true, that the greatest investment that you will ever make, the greatest return on investment that you will ever achieve, is money that helped another person go through life more honorably and prepared for heaven. If you can change a single person's life in a way that's permanent, you've done something of infinite value. That's a tremendous gift that God has given us, to have that power. And we ought to use it, and it does bring happiness to think of those that we have genuinely loved and helped. Thank you for your attention.